Okay, welcome everyone. Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Scott. I am a public historian and curator. I know that we are all coming from different places in this virtual space, which I am really glad for. I am now based in present-day Chicago, so I want to first send greetings from and acknowledge that here we are situated on the original homelands of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. Welcome to our session, Belonging and Displacement, Stories Beyond Inclusion. This session is inspired, among many other things, by the words of Pauli Murray, who is a civil rights and human rights activist you'll hear a little bit more about today, but specifically her words that are, "I've been cast aside, but I sparkle in the darkness. I've been cast aside, but I sparkle in the darkness." And so this session is really focusing on marginalized communities and the role of public historians and the frameworks that we use to tell the stories of marginalized communities and the limitations of those frameworks. In particular, we want to look at the limitation of the inclusion framework, which we all aspire towards, but some of the challenges in doing so. Public history has championed the stories of the marginalized and dispossessed for the past 40 years, expanding and deepening the overall historical enterprise. And in service to the goal of inclusiveness, the field has often emphasized our commonalities and our universal humanity, and sometimes silenced narratives of difference and displacement that fragment so many of our communities. How do we as public historians advance the conversation beyond inclusion to grapple with contradictions, counter narratives, and the oppositions that can seem jarring sometimes that these narratives reveal? How do we support spaces for critical dissent and accountability for human rights abuses that implicate our majority communities? So this session, we hope, opens a conversation that is based on a profound notion that belonging is very, very complex, and that striving for belonging is taking inclusion to another level. So in other words, we're trying to push the conversation around inclusion to get to belonging. If we are truly accountable to the publics and stories of our communities, how do we create socially just public history spaces where marginalized communities feel that they genuinely belong? This work raises many ethical, practical, and moral issues that challenge our ideas about power, invisibility, equity, and social change. So today we're going to look at a range of belonging and displacement stories and case studies among communities in Illinois, North Carolina, and Texas, and even globally, by looking at 3 areas of public history. I will begin by sharing a little bit about the new Chicago Monuments Project and focus on the role of public engagement to push past simplistic ideas of inclusion. Barbara Lau will examine an interpretive and programming process by reflecting on the challenge of creating a historic site in Durham, North Carolina, the Pauli Murray House, that embraces the complexity of stories and intersectional realities of African-American, same-gender loving human rights activist Pauli Murray. And Suzanne Seraph will focus on a documentation process that she and her students have been doing globally and locally in Central Texas to problematize the narratives of inclusion and belonging under COVID. And we also invite you to really think about your work, some of the questions you have, some of the challenges. I know the webinar format is limited in having a full discussion that we could have in person, but we're hoping through the Q&A mechanism that you can share comments, share examples, share questions that you may have for us. And we'll try to be as interactive and responsive as possible. Thank you. Next slide, please. So to reintroduce myself, my name is Jennifer Scott. In addition to being a public historian and curator, I was recently appointed as one of the 3 co-chairs of the Chicago Monuments Project Advisory Committee, which I'll tell you about. Next slide, please. And the question that I am trying to answer through the presentation is how a public engagement process, so focusing on that part of public history, how a public engagement process can intentionally address historical omissions and invite inclusion beyond simplistic representation. So what does that mean? That means getting beyond sort of like a Benetton model of, each person being represented, and asking how we push beyond that sort of model of just having people at the table. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about a recent initiative that started last summer. Next slide. In Chicago, 3 Christopher Columbus statues were taken down by the city of Chicago after much public protest and activism. There were clashes specifically between activists and the police, who were protesting, the activists were protesting the glorification of Christopher Columbus and the discovery of America and exploration that promoted the idea that civilization was brought to those who were deemed less civilized. And those who were supporting it saw Columbus more as a hero or an icon of their community or heritage. So they were removed. Next slide, please. In response, the city formed a new Memorials and Monuments initiative, which I mentioned, that is intended to assess the city's memorial monuments and public art collections and to make recommendations, and specifically to grapple with the distorted, the gaps in history that exist in Chicago, especially its founding histories, and many of which are very racialized, and to start having more shared conversations rather than separate conversations about this history and how they can be better represented in the public art landscape, in the monuments landscape. Next slide, please. So part of the charge was, of course, to create this committee, very, very diverse committee. I will say it's one of the most diverse groups that I've worked with since I've been in Chicago. Artists, activists, cultural and civic leaders, elected officials, historians, preservations are all represented, people with different backgrounds and different views. Part of our charge is cataloging monuments of the city and its sister agencies, the Parks District and the public schools. And I understand that this is the first time this kind of thorough assessment has been done, so it's pretty exciting to see what's actually there, to see who's missing and what are the omissions and distortions. A huge part of this project is the part that we're in right now that I wanted to share with you today, is the public engagement part. And it's not a sort of end destination product that we're creating. It's really designed to also help us think about what kind of recommendations to make. So it's really being used as a tool, and we're focusing a lot on process. And in the end, the committee will make recommendations about not only the existing collection, but the future of monuments. And the public engagement part is important for us because we're trying to learn as much as we can, not just how people feel about the existing monuments in Chicago, but how they feel about monuments and memorials in general. And this is the first time this conversation has ever happened. So lots of pressure, but it's excitement. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about the existing collections just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with when we talk about people missing from history and gaps and inclusion. Next slide, please. So out of 500 works so far, the city has flagged a little over 40 that are problematic. And these are under review, not elimination. So no recommendations have been made yet. These are really flagged to have more discussion, to have more conversation, to have more education around them. And so that's been sort of an interesting process, just to flag them for discussion. Why were they flagged? These are the broad reasons why. They promote narratives of white supremacy. They present inaccurate or demeaning characterizations of indigenous communities. They memorialize individuals with connections to heinous historical acts, like racist acts like slavery and genocide. They present one-sided stories of history, and they leave a lot of people out. In particular, women, people of color, and lots of different types of ideas and themes like labor, migration, community building. What we're learning is that a lot of the monuments that have been flagged were created around the same period, beginning with the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893. And for the next 30 or 40 years, it defined what public art and monuments would look like. And a lot of it had to do with how Chicago wanted to tell its shared history, how Chicago wanted to talk about its past and situate itself in this long trajectory of progress and civilization. Next slide, please. So before we get into the public engagement process, I just wanted to give you sort of visuals of what this looks like. It's easy to say white supremacy and then not map it to anything. So just to give you a sample of some of the monuments and plaques in the public way that have been flagged. This one I actually believe is no longer on view. The Kinsey Mansion plaque is a commemorative plaque that's actually placed on part of the Chicago River railing. It's from 1937. And you can see from reading the text that there's a kind of glorification of whiteness and non-nativeness. It doesn't talk about Native Americans, but clearly people were here inhabiting the land before any settlers or explorers came. And so again, there's a huge erasure when you see this plaque. Next slide. Another example is this Herman Atkins McNeil, Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet Memorial 1926. You can see Father Marquette and Joliet who are considered founders of Chicago, are in this upright position, sort of leading the way, and then this subservient backdrop, you see a portrayal of an indigenous person who's much more subservient, sort of bent over. And the idea, again, is this reinforced theme that Chicago was founded by the white bringers of civilization to supposed savages. Next slide. So in addition to caricatures and absences, there's also these kind of glorifications or idealizations of Native Americans in the collection. So you see the Bowman and Spearman, which is on a major boulevard in Chicago, and it's showing these kind of warrior stereotypes of Native Americans. Next slide. And this bust of Melville Fuller from 1912 represents the ways that we memorialize individuals and certain icons. In general, it's mostly war generals and presidents and founding fathers. Melville Fuller was an attorney and legislator who presided over Plessy versus Ferguson case that sanctioned separate but equal law and facilitated segregation for several decades. And so in a city like Chicago, which is one of the most segregated cities in the country, it's really important to have more discussion about why we're paying tribute and how we're paying tribute to this individual. Next slide, please. And the last example I'll show you of the collection is George Washington. What we're learning from the public feedback already is people are really surprised to see founding fathers like Lincoln and George Washington, who are seen as these leaders of liberty or the great emancipator. But why they were flagged is because they don't tell the whole story that, you know, of their participation, for example, in Indian removal or in owning slaves. And so we're only seeing one part of this history. Next slide, please. So in designing a public history sort of engagement process, that's trying to address caricatures and distortions and inaccuracies and also omissions, we didn't want to, we would feel like it was a failure if it came to the point where everybody said, well, the answer is everybody should have a monument. Every ethnic group should have a monument. Everybody who's missing should be represented. And so we wanted to design a public engagement process that would encourage people to talk with each other, learn with one another, while we can also learn what people care about, but also to think in a more integrated way of telling multifaceted stories. I mean, very similar to all that we aspire to do in public history. So we launched a website that you see an excerpt here, where people could actually go to see the monuments that had been flagged, and they could give direct feedback. And we're getting thousands and thousands of pieces of direct feedback about what people care about, why, or what they're glad about, or what they're not. And it's to promote a kind of discussion. Next slide, please. So just to give you sort of a laundry list of different engagements, we wanted to design different types of opportunities. And I'm not saying at all that this is the answer, because we're sort of in the middle of it and, you know, figuring this out as we go along. So in addition to direct website feedback, we also held a number of community stakeholder meetings of, for example, members from preservation communities in Chicago, from disability communities, from different ethnic communities, to see what people cared about and what is important to them. And then we took a lot of what we heard. We did a lot of listening, and which we continue to do. And we created themes that we then launched in a speaker series, which are kind of your typical panel of creative thinkers, artists, other leaders in various fields, speaking both locally and nationally, speaking on various issues and challenges of monuments and memorials and gaps in history. And you can see those on the website. And I could talk more about those themes. And I'll talk about these other ones in the next slide. Next slide, yeah. So we also wanted, so that was sort of like a, you know, this kind of national conversation, but we also wanted more intimate conversations. And so we had these weekly drop-in sessions where members from the advisory committee would volunteer to lead discussions with anyone who wanted to join. They could bring any questions, they could bring statements or comments, and to engage each other in conversation around any topic that has to do with monuments. Next slide, please. And then this deadline just closed last Friday. So when I say we're in the middle of it, we're in the middle of it. We put out a call for community partners to host programs on any topic that they want, or topics that have to do with either the existing collection, history, erasures, imagining, you know, the future of monuments, and the city would support a select number of these programs. And again, it's a way for us to learn what people care about, but it's also a way for people to learn from one another. They're completely open-ended, and to have a different level of intimacy and interaction. Next slide, please. So also a big part of this project is commissioning new work and thinking about alternative ways of sharing this history, writing our shared history through public art and through monuments. And so we want people to dream and imagine and to think about what's possible beyond the bronze plaque and the bronze statue that's larger than life. Next slide, please. So another a part of this, which I would consider a public engagement, is a request for ideas to reimagine new monuments. And it's a request for ideas because it's not a full proposal. You don't have to be an artist. You can be a resident, a community member, you can be an organization, you can partner. It's completely open-ended, and it's just starting to have ideas about how to think about either interventions or modifications that address the existing collection, like maybe something stood out to you that you really wanted to have in conversation, but also, you know, imagining brand new, non-traditional monuments and their formats as ways to talk about our shared history. Next slide, please. Oh, right. So one of our advisory members is Romy Crawford, who's an art historian who has a book coming out called Fleeting Monuments. And she raises these questions that are so important, I think, and the project is aligned with in getting people to think outside the box about new monuments and new ways of talking about history and shared history, thinking about if monuments need to be permanent or heroic, can they be portable? And there's some very public history elements in here, which I think is, you know, do you create monuments with this intention of it being revised, or, you know, history being revised or amended when history is reinterpreted in the future, which is a different way, I think, of seeing monuments, and I wonder what that would look like as well. So this is sort of a fun, exciting part of the project, that there's so much imagination involved. Next slide, please. Oh, so we're not there yet. That deadline hasn't happened. It happens in a couple of weeks. And so we don't know what it could look like. We will learn from this. But the idea was, again, was not to have everyone in separate conversations and to continue thinking about representation and inclusion in this very linear way, you know, or I guess representational way of everybody gets a monument, like Oprah, everybody gets a monument. But thinking of it more integrated and how we craft integrated stories. So I don't know what that looks like yet in Chicago, but I just wanted to share some clues to that I find nationally in activist interactions and interventions, some people call vandalism, with monuments. So here you see a slide from Take 'Em Down NOLA did an action of a former Supreme Court judge this is in front of the Louisiana Supreme Court in New Orleans, who was also a KKK member. And so they've hooded him and they've put signage, which I would call a modification, that says, this is what a terrorist looks like. So again, you're getting this conversation that's happening of people wanting to tell the whole story, wanting to engage with the monument that's already there, which is pretty interesting. And the last example I will share, next slide, is also a Take 'Em Down NOLA. It's of the founder Bienville. A lot of cities are wrestling with their founding history, I think, with these monuments, because a lot of them were created around the same time. So this is the founder of New Orleans, and you see this sign that says, "Gave us Bibles, stole our land," which again, I would argue is a conversation to say, let's tell more of the story. Let's tell how it looks if we tell a complex story. And to think more broadly and in more of an integrated way. So I will stop there and I will pass it over to Barbara Lau, my good friend and colleague from the Pauli Murray Center. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm sorry to jump the gun there. I guess for some people it's still morning. For me, it's starting to be the afternoon. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. I'm in Durham, North Carolina, which is the original home of the Shakori, Eno, Tuscarora, and the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. I work at the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, and having trouble advancing my own slides. And I've been asked to think about how can an interpretive process disrupt stereotypical ideas of inclusion and support intersectional practices. We at the Pauli Murray Center have no problem with this, in part because of the inspiration for our site. We are still in the process of emergence. We are not full-time open, even if we weren't in COVID. We do have this installation on the lawn, but we're still working on the renovation and rehabilitation of this historic 1898 house and grounds. So look for more from us coming in the future. But as I mentioned, the challenge is to think about how we inspire others through lifting up the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, who had multiple identities but also sought an integrated body, mind, and spirit throughout their life. And so these are our mission and vision statements, in that thinking about how do we work across difference, how do we embrace the transformative power of storytelling and truth telling, and how this could also potentially lead to healing and to addressing enduring inequities, which is really what Pauli Murray did throughout their lifetime. So as I mentioned, Pauli has quite an interesting place in the world. And I often use this Venn diagram or a Venn diagram to share this idea of where we want to be working and where Pauli Murray was living. Pauli was born in 1910 and lived until 1985. One might say that their work intersected with all of the major human rights issues of the 20th century. They were someone who was of multiracial background, but also identified by society as African American. They were a person who grew up in the South. They were a person of faith, being a part of an Episcopal and AME family. They were a person that grew up in by economy, a working class family, but by other measures, very much an educated group, a group of teachers and nurses, folks that believed in supporting the common good and the uplift of the race. Pauli Murray was someone who at times felt themselves a woman trapped in a man's body, in fact, sought hormone treatment in the 1930s. They were someone who had relationships with women and men, but primarily with women throughout their lifetime. They were a person who attained a great deal of education, 5 advanced degrees over the course of their lifetime, 3 law degrees and 2 divinity degrees, an undergraduate degree in English. But they were someone who was very sensitive to that way that society was inviting them to be separated. In a letter in the 1960s to the National Organization for Women, who had invited Pauli to be a part of their board, Pauli Murray said, you know, don't ask me to be a woman one day, a worker the next, a Negro another. I need to find the unifying principles in which I can operate. And Pauli went on to say, for you, this might be good politics. For me, this is the price of survival. And I think that as we think about how to ethically and, you know, with creativity, think about this person's inspiration, the wisdom and vision that Pauli Murray has for the world, how do we think about what we do at our site? Over Pauli Murray's 75 years, we know from their FBI file that they lived at 50 different addresses. And so this site that is our historic house and grounds, the site that was built by their grandparents, Pauli Murray grew up there after their mother passed away. They were one of 6 children, the only one to grow up in Durham. The remaining children grew up in Baltimore. But this is the challenge, is how do we think about the intersectional complexity of 20th century America? And how do we think about that in relation to where we are, which is to try to be creating a roadmap for our future and our future programs. So instead of choosing a traditional way of thinking about interpretive planning by looking at sort of established periods of significance or eras created primarily by historians, we thought, well, what would happen if we put Pauli Murray and Pauli Murray's experience of the 20th century in the center of our enterprise? We understood that Pauli had been a part of these various movements and various eras of history. Susan Ware, a noted American historian, says that, you know, when looking back at 20th century America, all roads lead to Pauli Murray. So in fact, Pauli invites us to see not just the impact and the strategies and the histories of these rights movements, but to see the ways in which they intersect and overlap. When Pauli was at Howard Law School in the 1940s, they discovered that they were being discriminated against, not because of their race. In fact, they were in a more homogenous racial environment, but in fact, because of their gender. And at that time, Pauli Murray coined the term Jane Crow. So this was something that Pauli was looking at throughout their life, and it was important for us to think about how to do that. So when we started to think about, well, what happens if we put Pauli in the center of our process, and our process, again, disrupting what we think we know about American history, what we think about those eras and periods of significance, what we did was we looked for the through lines, the things in Pauli Murray's life that connected their work, their scholarship, their creative work, their activism, their personal life, all these things. What were those? And we came up with these 5 through lines: activism, creativity, justice, faith, and locality. Pauli Murray actually wrote an amazing book about our site. It's called Proud Shoes, The Story of an American Family, published in 1956. Well before these kinds of memoirs were a part of many book lists, and again, in fact, republished in the 1970s after the Roots series was on television. So Pauli was clearly a person ahead of their time, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was mentored by Polly at Yale Law School and later wrote a new introduction to Proud Shoes, said that Polly pulled history along with her. So what we did was we chose these through lines and we organized convenings based on those through lines. We called them think tanks. And, we didn't have all the money at once. And so it took a little while to get all of these done. We'd sort of raise a little more money and do another one. But we had 5 gatherings over the course of 4 years. They were multiple days. So people would come in, were from out of town, and we would spend 2 days together. They ranged in size from 18 to 24 participants. We tried to pay attention to sort of the diversity of experience, diversity of the kinds of expertise people were bringing. We wanted to have public historians and museum folk, people who grew up in the neighborhood, people who were going to bring us various points of view. So age, gender, sexual orientation. We also made it a point to include our board members and Murray Fitzgerald family members. This was a learning experience for all of us. And in fact, there wasn't a model for us. We were sort of making this up as we went along, but we discovered some powerful elements of these gatherings that made them productive, made them generative, made them memorable, made them engaging. And in fact, in some cases, changed the lives of the people who were participating in them, as well as resulted in a powerful plan for our future. So as Jennifer was saying, when she was talking about founding history, we recognize that how things start matter. And so it was important as we were designing these gatherings that there was ample food, that we were joining together in a way that was initially about community building. We were very pleased to work with a very skilled facilitator, Janine Bryant, who helped to brought a lot of expertise to designing these gatherings. And we really felt that opening with a more social, a more get to know each other sort of event. And in fact, Janine also added what she called disruption activities. So encouraging people to disrupt the way that they would maybe be thinking about how they organize themselves or who they saw in the room that they might be connected to, just as a way to set the scene for the time together. And then we opened the second day always at the Polly Murray house, even though it's not yet really visitor ready. We often would gather inside, as you can see on the picture of everybody looking up for the selfie. Often in this case, we would do an activity that was, again, generative. We would do a sound circle. We would gather to try to feel the space and connect with the place that we were, connect with the spirit of Polly and Polly's family. We also were challenging ideas of leadership because our groups tended to be people, again, diverse ages, generations, expertise. We sent out bios of everyone ahead of time so folks had a sense of who was there, but we wanted to make sure that everyone knew that everyone could lead. And so we were pleased to work with a talented performer and dancer, Aya Shabu, who would often lead us in these flocking activities, which is a way for a group to naturally, without speaking, through movement, shift leadership. When you think about flocking, think of geese. So, first there's people working in fours, and then the fours gather with other groups. And in the end, the whole group is moving naturally, changing direction. And whoever is in front as we change direction would set the tone, would change the movement, and everyone was invited to follow. So a very powerful way to experience leadership on the part of everyone in the group. We also spent time at the beginning of the second day listening to Polly. We would play an audio excerpt. We're blessed to have several audio resources so that we could think about something related to the theme that Polly might speak to us about, and to have structured listening to other people sharing stories. Again, to set the tone about the way we want it to be. We do really believe that the process of how we do things is as important as the outcome. So you can see there's flip charts, there was small group work and dyad work and work that was focused on different strategies and elements that you might think of as part of an interpretive plan. But we wanted to make sure that we all had a chance to practice listening and practice speaking. We thought about this idea of spheres of influence. We thought about who were we connected to, who were we accountable to, how might we use the Pauli Murray Center as a launch pad for other activities, and who were our sibling sites, our organizations that overlapped with us, and what were the theories, tactics, and actions that might move our programming to really embodying our mission. Oops. And built in to this entire time together was always reflection. So each participant was actually given a small notebook at the beginning that they could use to do whatever, take notes or make notes to themselves. And throughout the time together, there were moments where people were invited to reflect, were invited to walk and think, invited to share ideas. So sometimes that was in groups, but often that was something that people did on their own. And at the end of every session, we invited people to give us their hopes and prayers. What were their hopes and prayers? Write a letter to the center about what they hoped would happen in the future. And these were amazing, amazing pieces of writing. They just so inspired. They're full of really amazing ideas. They're just full of really positive, creative energy. And it was a really great way to ask people to reflect on their experience of the think tank and to share more with us. We took all of the hopes and prayers from all 5 think tanks and we dropped them into a Wordle, and we came up with this, which again is a way to surface themes and ideas that can carry us through as we start to think about how do we know we're going to be on track with the program ideas that we come up with? How do we think about the way we put those ideas together? And so this was a great way to just help us see across the 5 think tanks what was surfacing, what were people thinking about and sharing through their hopes and prayers. So we took all of the notes and the information that was transcribed from all 5 think tanks. We worked with several facilitators, actually consultants. Jennifer was actually one of our lead consultants, and we also worked with an emerging professional who Jennifer was able to mentor, and then members of our staff. And we started to synthesize the reports coming out of these various think tanks. And these are some of the headers of some of the elements of what resulted, which we're calling our Compass programming plan, something that would help us set the direction. So part of it shares, who is Pauli Murray? What is the center? How did we get here? But other parts of it begins to outline our philosophy, our ideas about who we're accountable to. We identified 11 different communities of accountability, folks that we feel because of Pauli Murray's experience and our own mission that we need to think about being accountable to. Now, this is certainly an area that we need to continue to expand. What does it mean? How will we know we're accountable? What does that process look like? That is something that we continue to work on, but we wanted to make sure that we recognize that in the Compass plan. Documentation of what have become our signature programs over the course of our work over the last 10 years. And then thinking forward, the goals, tactics, and strategies, and the critical questions that become the gauntlet through which ideas get sieved. Does it meet this? Does it meet this? How do we know that ideas are aligned with all these other elements of our Compass plan? And then outlines about our spaces, about what it means to, right now to be online, all these various pieces. And then, of course, the appendices that are the materials that were generated through the think tanks. So this is the end of my presentation. We are very excited to be now using that. We're in the process now of sharing that with our board of directors. And we just had a wonderful board retreat where we were thinking about having looked at the Compass plan, how do we signal to people who are then going to be visiting our site welcome and belonging? What do those signals look like? What does that look like in programming? What does that look like in site elements? What does that look like in engagement with our organization? And so the Compass plan has really served its purpose in the sense that it is becoming the launch pad for all of our future activities. Thank you very much. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Suzanne Seraph.
Thanks, Barbara. My name is Susie Seraph. I'm talking to you today from the University of Texas at Austin, and I too feel that it's important to acknowledge the traditional territory of a number of indigenous peoples upon which the university stands, including the Apache, the Alabama Coushatta tribe of Texas, the Kickapoo, the Isleta del Sur, the Lipan Apache, the Texas Band of Yaqui, the Kwawaltecan, particularly because what I'm going to be talking about today is a process of documentation, of preservation in the face of a global pandemic. And we all know the history of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas and the wiping out of, as some estimate, 90% of the indigenous populations because of the diseases that were brought and the epidemics that were brought with them onto virgin soil. It's been almost exactly a year since our world was turned upside down with what we have come to recognize as a global health crisis, a global pandemic, the likes of which we have not been seen for over a century. Next slide, please. So here's the main question, which is a question about documentation and how do we confront the myth of inclusion by archiving the words and works of those who are intentionally or covertly excluded. Next slide. Next slide. So from the very beginning, the pandemic violently revealed the truth of what many had been preaching for a very long time. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., spoken at a convention of the Medical Committee for Human Rights in Chicago in March of 1966, and you can see it here on a splashed on a wall, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and the most inhumane. Scholars have noted actually that this is an incorrect quote, that actually he said injustices in health is the most shocking and inhuman. And I make that point because he's speaking specifically about the health of marginalized people and speaking of it not just as inhumane, but actually inhuman, especially when you consider the end of this quote, which is that the result leads to physical death. It is these injustices and inequities that we have all seen in the last year, spray painted on shuttered business fronts, splashed across protest signs and picket lines, tagged on sidewalks and pavements, and pinned in poetry words, corridos, scroll paintings across the world. I'm going to show you a series of slides of some of the graphic graffiti and tags and on walls in the United States and across the world that show some of the inequities. Next slide, please. The next three are inequities of racism. This one and the next one were produced right after the George Floyd murder. Racism as a public health crisis. And the next one was in the early days of the pandemic when China was and the Chinese were being blamed as the causes of the virus. And here you have a cartoon that shows a Chinese person. Do I look like Corona? a person from Africa, I have nothing to do with Ebola, and a person, an African American person, what makes you think I have AIDS? Not a virus hashtag. Next slide. Police brutality related to the virus. Next slide. This one is from Athens. Next slide. The anxiety of voting fraud and voter rights. Next slide. Housing evictions and inequities in the wake of the pandemic. Next slide. The revelation of domestic violence and its difficulties in stay-at-home orders. Oh, this is another one for rent eviction. Next slide. Quarantine spreads the virus of patriarchy. We won't leave anyone alone behind closed doors. Next slide. The way in which the pandemic has affected the unhoused. You can't stay at home if you have no home. And the next slide. Justice means a disability-centered response to COVID-19. Next slide. When Martin Luther King spoke the prophetic words about health as the most shocking and most inhuman form of injustice, inequity, and exclusion, his justification was, quote, because it often results in physical death. And the next words out of his mouth at this conference in 1966 were a mandate that is as true today as it was a half a century ago. He said, quote, I see no alternative to direct action and creative nonviolence to raise the conscience of the nation, or in this case, the world. Artists, writers, musicians have taken this mandate of direct action and creative nonviolence literally to the streets to perform, depict, and bear witness to these proliferating acts of injustice in the face of the pandemic in ways whose very publicity, immediacy, monumentality can do nothing less than catch our attention, engage us in conversation, catalyze our outrage, and provoke action, especially at a time when the usual places, next slide, of cultural contestation, our coffee houses, our theaters, our lecture halls, even our museums have dramatically shuttered their doors. These acts of public declaration and documentation stand in the face of, next slide, and actively resist the fickleness, the callousness, and the downright lies of our politicians and our nightly news over the past year. These are some quotes from our former president, Trump, over the course of the months of the pandemic when he was in office. Next slide. These artistic acts expose injustice underlying our easy rhetoric of inclusion and belonging in the midst of a global pandemic. They expose the injustice around concrete decisions that had to have been made about who's worthy of care, who's essential, and who's expendable, especially in light of concrete life-saving questions such as who gets limited PPE equipment, who has early access to the vaccine, who's worthy of a ventilator or an intensive care bed, who's eligible for a stimulus package, for whom does the shelter-in-place mandate translate to certain deaths, risk, and even death. These artistic acts of documentation are themselves acts of resistance and what some scholars have defined as radical care as a kind of political warfare that exposes the systemic inequalities, the power structures, and the economic systems in our midst that have resulted in these generations of institutional neglect, positioning some groups as worthy of receiving resources against others, determining who is worthy of care and who is not. Next slide. I learned this message firsthand from the traditional artists with whom I've worked in a number of exhibitions over the last decade when I was curator and director of the Gallery of Conscience at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe. Next slide. In an exhibition on natural disaster called The Art of Survival, Haitian voodoo flag maker, who you saw in the previous slide, Mireille Delisme, was one of a number of artists throughout the island who chronicled the destruction that happened in the wake of the earthquake, when buildings lay on people, cutting off their legs, burying babies, killing people in their midst. When I asked her why she felt compelled to depict such scenes in such graphic detail, she spoke poignantly of the need to capture the moment, she said, before the 6 o'clock news cameras turn to the next piece of breaking news and our tragedy is forgotten. Next slide. In another exhibit in the Gallery of Conscience on HIV/AIDS, South African figural embroiderer Maria Ringane spoke eloquently of the need to not be ashamed, to speak up. You must not be silent, she said. Next slide. You must not be ashamed to speak out. Tell the community. When you keep quiet, she said, you sign your own death warrant. While community artists around the world are using their talents to bear witness to the injustices exposed through the coronavirus, we public historians and museum curators and community scholars and university archivists have also pivoted in the past year to document, preserve, and archive these spontaneous expressions of public art around the world. Next slide. Sometimes this has been called rapid response recovery projects. These documentation, preservations, and even exhibition projects that have occurred throughout the United States and throughout the world over the last year. This is a clip from a website called Urban Art Mapping COVID-19 Street Art, from which many of the images that I showed earlier on were taken. Next slide. The Public Art and COVID-19 Archive is another public archive whose mission is to make public art more public by providing free and low-cost resources for the public art field. Next slide. And one such digital COVID archive housed at the National Library of Medicine, I don't have a slide for this one, but is designed as an international scrapbook that they say very clearly serves as a warning for what we did wrong. In a talk at the University of Texas about the future of museums in a post-pandemic world, world-renowned museum and heritage scholar Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet talks about what she calls anticipatory heritage or anticipatory history making. Next slide. A model of cultural production, she says, if you're familiar with her very well-known piece from the 1980s called Theorizing Heritage. She said, heritage is a mode of cultural production in the present that has recourse to the past. In this talk, she said, anticipatory heritage is a mode of cultural production in the present that is not yet past, but that we anticipate will one day be past. For BKG, the focus is on the creation of heritage, including collections, exhibitions, archives, the significance of which is not yet known. Significance in terms of what to collect, what to exhibit, what to tell about, a moment for future generations in an act that's happening in the present, that's unfolding right now in the present. This is very similar in some ways to the way in which archives and museums began to collect immediately in the wake of the 9/11 crisis. Although here it's not a crisis that happened in a literal moment, it's a crisis that has been unfolding over the course of a year. Next slide. Note the title of this article in last week's New Yorker. It's called "The Race to Collect COVID Ephemera Before Its History." It is history. And it goes on to say, it's from the New York Historical Society, has spent the pandemic year scrounging for tomorrow's museum artifacts. The question here is, what is worthy of collection? An interesting quandary of what's worthy of collection. At the same time, in real time, doctors, governments, hospitals are trying to decide what's worthy, who's worthy of saving. And here we are also talking about what's worthy, who's worthy of collecting. It's at times like these, when time itself stands at a year-long standstill, that we see the true nature of folk expression as we saw in the graffiti murals, that work at their most raw, their most powerful state to bear witness, to give voice, to fight to remember, to operate a moral imperative, to mark the injustice and inequities and exclusions of this time as they are happening, while time slips our grasp and seems to laugh at our folly. As public historians, we must bring to bear our discipline's focus on notions of ephemerality, liminality, improvisation, memorialization, to try to shed light on this impulse to bear witness, to historicize, to heritageize, to call out, to protest, when, as Haitian poet Evelyn Trujillo remarked in a poetic elegy after the earthquake, quote, "I don't even recognize the words coming out of my mouth." Next slide, please. Last spring and continuing throughout the year, when the University of Texas campus was closed after spring break and all of our classes shifted online, my students and I engaged in a series of archivization and documentation projects specifically designed to preserve and in some cases exhibit the community stories and truth sharing and witnessing that we saw happening in our midst. The first was a project with a group of students and faculty. We had won a President's Award for Global Learning last year, and we were all set to spend the summer in Kenya to work with a group of women living with HIV/AIDS who had banded together in an artist co-op, and we were going to explore the ways in which the practice of art making and cooperative living and economic sustainability helped the women with education, with mutual aid, and with economic sustainability. When that project, when we were no longer allowed to go to Kenya, we switched gears very quickly, next slide, and developed a project called Folk Art in the Time of COVID, which involved many of the artists that I'd been working with over the past 10 years around the world, where the students wrote to the artist, next slide, called them on the phone, uh, uh, chatted with them on Snapchat to ask questions about how they were dealing in the wake of COVID. Many of them talked about the financial crisis. Many of them talked about shifting their business online. Many of them talked about mutual aid. But what I specifically want to focus on today is the artists who spoke about the moral imperative to bear witness. Next slide. Like this artist, another one of the figurative embroidery artists from South Africa, who specifically used their art, this is embroidery, to document the people who were getting evicted, people who had no food, people who were dying, the police brutality in the streets, the closing and shuttering of doors of businesses, the lack of PPE equipment in hospitals and things like that. Next slide. In July of this year, retablo maker Claudio Jimenez Quispe suffered the loss of a family member from COVID-19. And he wrote to us and he said, "We had to face a difficult situation in an unprecedented context where hospitals collapsed. We could not go out without being stopped by the police, and medicine was not enough for all. It was a difficult situation, but it allowed us to better understand the great magnitude of the virus in the world and its consequences in the cities." He created this retablo specifically to talk and to bear witness about the issue of people being forced from the urban cities back to their rural roots because of the absence of food and the absence of work in the cities. The death in the hospitals, the overrun of the morgues and the cemeteries and things like that. Next slide. In India, in West Bengal, a traditional scroll painter, Gurupada Chitrakar, wrote to us about the ways in which he was using his traditional, and many of the people in this village were using their traditional scroll painting arts to get the word out, not only about prevention and treatment of coronavirus, but also the insisting on government intervention, the need for testing, the need for vaccines, and things like that. Next slide. Again, in South Africa, Lulama Silabeni, who has a cooperative, a beadworking cooperative, speaks eloquently about the need to always work with the people, with the folk, because that's what puts folk in the folk arts. Next slide. In another class called Contested Heritage on Display, after the middle of the semester when the students no longer could come to class, we shifted to a final project where I asked students to document their own communities about how they were responding in the face of COVID. And I wanted to show you one project, and then first documentation, and the second part of it was to create an exhibition or a mock exhibition based on this project. And I'm going to roll through these slides very quickly, but this one was two students who banded together who were longtime organizers. So they looked specifically at the kind of mutual aid organizing that comes from the bottom up from communities, the way in which communities not only document the needs of the community, but engage with clients and each other and community members to get their needs met. So Barbara, if you'll just roll through these slides very quickly. Next slide. Next slide. So you can see how these students engaged their artists, they engage the community, and they also engage the audiences. Okay. Finally, I just wanted to say very quickly, this past fall, I have a social justice internship course where the students worked in many of these organizations in Central Texas. And I had them work in their internships, which were 10 hours a week, to document the ways in which the organizations were responding to the inequities exposed in their midst in the wake of the coronavirus. And these were organizations that deal with the historically unhoused, people who were living on the street, people who work with the incarcerated, people who work with people with mental illness. And I wanted to look in the last two slides, next slide, at one organization which is called Texas After Violence Project, whose mission is to record the stories of people impacted by structural violence. Next slide. When the coronavirus hit, they developed a project called Sheltering Justice, which was specifically about documenting the impact of COVID on the prison system in Texas by interviewing families with loved ones who were incarcerated, advocates, and people who were formerly incarcerated. And one of the things they did, again, talking about the process of documentation in a time of crisis, was they had already developed relationships with formerly incarcerated. So they were using people who were part of the system or had been part of the system to be the interviewers and archivists and documentarians in this moment of crisis. Next slide. And I wanted to end with the words of the Executive Director of Texas After Violence Project, Gabe Solis, who said, "We recognize that to shelter justice, we must follow in the traditions of past movements that emerged from crisis and listen deeply to the voices of those who are directly and disproportionately impacted for understanding, guidance, and lessons as we move into the future together. As public historians, archivists, curators, documentarians, this too is our charge: to listen carefully, to collaborate closely, and to work directly with our communities, in our communities, for understanding and guidance as we move to the future of documentation together." Thank you.
Thank you to my co-panelist. I'm going to invite you, Barbara, to have your video come on too. We want to acknowledge our fourth panelist, Yolanda Leyva, who unfortunately couldn't be with us here today, but we're holding a place for her anyway. She had a personal emergency and represents the part of public history that she was going to talk about, which I think is on the next slide. Around, oh no, we don't have any more. Okay, she was going to focus on exhibitions, that part of public history. So we just wanted to acknowledge her and wish her, oh, we do have it. How can an exhibition process be just, ethical, and inclusive when it is unable to have direct contact with creators and impacted communities? We're not going to answer it for her, but that was the question in case some of you resonate with that part of the process. So we want to spend the rest of the time kind of hashing out all the rich layers, but we want to invite all of you in the Q&A segment. I don't think the chat is enabled, but in the Q&A, let us know, even if it's just a comment, did this resonate on any level? How is it resonating? Do you have an example or a challenge? What we're talking about here, and I hope you were able to get that sense, is not just about how public historians represent marginalized communities or connect with or reflect their stories or hear from them or center them, but even the most vulnerable of those communities, how we connect, and also how to avoid and even do better than avoid, but proactively work against some of the typical conventional ideas of inclusion. And this is in a time where everybody is calling out, needed rightful charges of needing to pay more attention to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. So we want to hear from you through your questions and comments. What challenges have you had, or what success have you had? We're not professing to have all the answers. These are just some ways that we were hoping to prompt ideas around this and thinking past just checking a box of diversity, which I'm sure is frustrating for a lot of us on this call. So while you are sending in your Q&As, I don't see any yet, I just want to get our discussion started among the panelists. One of the things that I thought was interesting, I was hearing through your presentations, all of our presentations, was this sign of who's worthy, who's essential, whether it's for a memorial or for documentation or for telling their story. And there was a question about permanence, and ephemerality. So in the case of Susie, you're talking about things that are probably not going to last forever. The same with memorials. I was talking about sort of the bronze versus the more temporal formats. And I know that, Barbara, you didn't talk about this, but you're thinking through the interpretive process about whether you will be a museum that collects. And so I just wonder if you all would comment a little bit about the idea of permanence in reflecting marginalized communities or expression of marginalized communities, permanence or ephemeral, how that works or doesn't work.
So I can start that by just sharing something that is actually on our grounds right now. There's a labyrinth on the ground that was part of the Pauli Murray birthday celebration last fall in November that's focused on hope, loss, and joy. Just trying to name some of the things that folks were sharing with us about what was happening in the community and inviting people to create something together that would allow for their voice to be heard in some sense in that place, and that folks could then come and reflect on that. They could walk in the labyrinth that's on the grounds. Obviously, it's not going to be there forever. The materials that it's created with will not last, but we really do try to think about that way that many of our activities are generative, whether that's through poetry or through the co-creation of something, that in some way that does foster a sense of belonging, that does foster a sense of inclusion. It's always powerful to go somewhere and see yourself reflective, whether that's because you're revisiting this site where you've left something, your shoe or a rock or something else in the labyrinth, or you've contributed an idea that you really are excited to see in action or on the wall or as part of an exhibit or program. So it really has, I think that we have limited space, we have limited capacity in terms of that longer term permanence. I don't think that we have this idea that we're going to create a permanent exhibit that will always be there. Pauli Murray's relevance, the relevance of Pauli's ideas has really shifted tremendously. I mean, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we started our work in Durham, really nobody had ever heard of Pauli Murray except a handful of scholars. And since then, we're seeing now a new documentary. We're seeing Pauli Murray being referenced in the new Netflix series about the 14th Amendment. It was amazing to hear Pauli Murray's name come out of Will Smith's lips, as part of this very high profile major media project. So as what we can draw from that experience and that wisdom changes, we want to be able to reflect that in our work. So I think that being able to think about things, where's the continuum between impermanence and permanence, like living in different places in that continuum is where we are seeing that. And I think that's really true of this notion of inclusion and as this process and the ways that it's engaged and how we engage with these ideas and for us, our communities of accountability.
If I could, there are beginning to get some very interesting questions in the Q&A. So I want to be brief because I would like to get to some of these questions, but I think that the idea of permanence has been so much a part of the hegemonic mindset of what is worthy of being marked on the landscape to stay. And in general, that has been the voices, the profiles, the portraits, the monuments of the dominant narrative, the dominant white hegemonic heteronormative narrative. And to me, there's something very exciting about consciously choosing ephemerality and impermanence as a way of countering that idea of stationary permanence. What I love about these public street arts is that they are ephemeral, but they are also huge. They're larger than life. So they are both ephemeral and monumental at the same time, which I love about them.
Thank you. Thank you for those of you who are submitting questions and comments. I'm going to start going through them. The first one, inclusion is tied to relationship building. A number of nonprofits I've worked with seem to be treading water, very true, in general, overworked staff, et cetera. So the relationship building can frequently fall into being lower priority. What are a few strategies to help nonprofits dedicate the time to build relationships before there is an emergency terrible event? Great question. Susie, you seem like you have a
I think we all have a lot of experience with this, as probably do you, Sarah. Thank you for asking this question. I think one of the issues that this question raises is, for all of us, what we're seeing is a need for a fundamental difference in process. And the statement that inclusion is not a goal, it's a process, is a simple statement that has a very complicated reality. And the reality is there is no quick and dirty solution, that if your goal is community collaboration and collaboration among and with multiple nonprofits, there is no, it has to be written and infused into the very mission of your organization, every aspect of the process. So you're absolutely right. It can't just be called forth in a moment when an emergency strikes, because no one has time. And also the building of trust and relationship takes time. So that has to happen over time, and it has to be a priority.
So I don't want to
Barbara?
get too sort of therapy on y'all, but someone once said to me that we train people how to treat us. And I really think this is true with organizations as well. So we train some of our visitors how they, what their expectations might be. We train our boards what their expectations might be. And when we choose process, when we choose to recognize the humanity of the people that are participating in our programs, in our leadership, when we model that and sort of push forward with that, it begins to, I think, shift the way that we work. I do think this is a little bit more challenging when it comes a bit to funders, especially the movement towards sort of evidence-based outcomes, and we want the exhibit up. But this is, if there is a silver lining of COVID, this is one of the lessons of COVID. We can't take things for granted. Things may take a lot longer than we anticipate because there are many things around us that are beyond our control. And so I do think that that this starts in very small ways, and that we build upon those, and that when we build, and we've discovered the power of ritual. Ritual when we open all of our programs and events with a quote from Pauli Murray. Ritual when we take the time at our board meetings to do a check-in that everyone at the board meeting participates in. Those might seem like they're separate from the program, but they're not. And so I think as we begin to shift the way that we work as leaders in this field, we will also shift the expectations that people have of our institutions and of our programs. So yeah, embrace the wholeness of our experience.
I have also found that funders are beginning to understand this, and that they can also be convinced. I have had a number of projects where I have convinced the National Endowment for the Humanities or the National Endowment for the Arts that I can't tell you what the product will be or what the exhibit will be at all. That what I'm asking for money for is the process, is the relationship building, and funders are intrigued.
So that was a combination of, those responses are great. They're a combination of a couple of the questions that we have there. I think I'm glad that you both brought up COVID and the reset. It's sort of been a forced reset, but it'll be interesting to see what opportunity museums have and sees in making it a practice. So people are asking for tips or strategies on shifting that from focus on product to process. And Barbara suggested one of ritual. I'm just wondering if there's other strategies to help with that resocialization that, in a way, I think we're all kind of going through right now.
I would argue too that language is really powerful here in the way that we talk about things, right? There's no sense that for us to talk about going back. There is no going back. We all know that as being public historians or people work in public humanities, but again, in this moment is the invitation to think about a different future and to, think more broadly. Of course, we, like everybody else, started to shift everything we had planned as in-person programming to virtual. And at first it was just kind of a transform this to this. But what's really happened is sort of a reopening, us having to question, why did we assume that our audience for this or our participants in this would only be from this place geographically or this experience? And I think that while it's sometimes overwhelming to think about all those possibilities, and trying to work, I feel sorry, for example, for the teachers in North Carolina who are now being asked to teach in person in class and online at the same time. I think that's not the direction that we want to go. But the notion that communities can be built in very different ways than we anticipated. Very small example, we have a monthly book club. It wasn't meant to be, it just is a program we really felt we wanted to do. And now the participants in that, even in groups as small as 20 people, tend to be coast to coast and often people from outside the United States. So it's just inviting us to think in a different way about who and how and what kind of relationships are possible, and how to help all, how not to leave anyone behind, how to make sure that we're engaging with folks that have varying degrees. This is another aspect of diversity, varying degrees of access and knowledge and comfortableness with online platforms. So, it's challenging us to shift our own thinking about what we do, but I think the language that we use to describe it or to think about that, and then stepping back and saying, well, no, participant, guest, visitor, that now means more than it used to, and let's reflect on that in our process.
I would say that another strategy for inclusion is a real commitment to including community members and diverse community members from the very beginning in the process and in the creation of the process, so that Julie, you talked about, or Sarah, I guess, talked about nonprofits doing work together. And I think that the key is not just to get the executive directors or the program officers of the nonprofits together to try to create projects together, but rather to create a sustainable advisory committee of community members. If you're working with queer communities, have people from the community as part of the process all the way through.
In the comments, it seems like there's a strong resonance with what I would call yet another strategy that Barbara brought out in her presentation, of becoming aware of intersectional oppressions. And so people are saying, not choosing one identity, not having to choose, and just wondering if you both wanted to say a little bit more about that, because I know you both incorporate that as well.
Well, let me just say that of all the things that we're trying to do, that is by far the most disruptive, right? Disruptive of the ways that we have thought about doing this work in the past. And so literally, as we think about putting Pauli Murray in the center of our enterprise, as we think about starting from a place of wholeness, that is so radical in a way to the way that I think we're even brought up to think, right? We're brought up to think that in order to understand things, you divide it, you understand the pieces, then you put the pieces back together, and somehow by doing that, you'll understand the whole. Well, that's not actually true when you think about human experience. I can't say that if I look at myself this way, as a queer person, as a woman, as a person who grew up in the North, that somehow knowing all those things, I'm going to really understand myself or my experience by understanding those pieces. Yes, I think that contributes, but I think the challenge is to start from the place of wholeness. It's where a lot of discussion is going these days. We're thinking about how do we show up whole in the places we work, in our families, in the world. What does it mean to live in a world in which we can do that? Obviously, that was the vision that Pauli Murray had, but it's very, unfortunately, because we're not socialized that way, it feels very counterintuitive. So in the sense of starting the kind of work that we do in this realm from that place, when we think about who we're talking to, who we're engaging with, who we're documenting with, it's I find that very challenging. But I do think that is the invitation. How can we, and I think, Jennifer, you actually have talked about this, instead of each community in Chicago having their own monument, what does it mean for us to build a history that is actually reflective of all of those experiences? I mean, it's very difficult, but it is, I think, the place that we need to go if one of our goals is recognizing the damage, the impact, the price of this social injustice, recognizing its impact, beginning to try to be accountable to that, and then hoping to move toward repair and healing.
We just got another question in that I think is a follow-up question to Susie's point about community participation and involving community, asking about, not just engaging, sort of, commenting that we also need to empower them. I just wanted you all to comment on what that means.
I wanted to pick up on that comment, and also the last part of Julie Peterson's question, which was commenting on how much she appreciated Barbara's idea of the process being more important than the product, and asking any advice for shifting this emphasis. And I would say that my experience in the Gallery of Conscience has been that we tried to create a space that was 100% about the process and not ever about the product, so that exhibits were constantly evolving as community members were coming in for dialogue, we're coming in to add art, we're coming in to engage around an issue. The exhibit would change, the interactives would change as audience members were coming in. So I think that is one way to authentically empower communities and audiences to be part of the process, and not just to comment on the result or add a sticky to a interactive sticky note blackboard, but rather to see the space change and evolve as communities are empowered to engage in the process. I will also say that that's very taxing on an institution, and it's very difficult on an institution that has rules and policies in place about collecting and collections and archivization and things like that. So having a commitment to that kind of prototyping and constant change is very important.
So yes, good note to end on. Difficult but possible. I want to thank my co-panelists, Barbara and Susie, and all of you for joining us in this conversation. We wish we could be together in person having this conversation. Thank you for all of your attention and questions, and feel free to keep in touch if you have follow-up questions. We hope to meet those of you we haven't met and see old friends the next time we're together. Thank you all, and best wishes in your research going forward and all of your work. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.